All right, hello everyone. This is your week 9 lecture on the consequences of incarceration and reentry. Let's just review the learning objectives before we jump in. So the learning objectives for this lesson that you will be able to describe the major consequences of incarceration on one's mental and physical health, relationships, and successful reentry, evaluate the role that social support plays in reentry, and support reentry policy that focuses on a health-based model of desistance. So we're first going to discuss the article Social Support in Daily Life at Reentry by Naomi Sugi and Dallas Augustine. So they discuss social integration and looking at social supports, specifically that social supports are a key to preventing recidivism. So social relationships and supports serve as a buffer for people who are experiencing stressful situations and life crises, particularly those who are returning home from prison. Social supports can mitigate mental and physical health consequences that reentrants are facing. So in this study, individuals reported that social support could be either the most positive or the most stressful experiences of their day. It was most stressful when they were dealing with death, health issues, and illness of close family or friends. This also provides validation and esteem to help these individuals handle stressful situations and crises. Social supports can also be a source of respite and retreat, as well as help provide coping resources for these individuals. When it was reported as a source of stress, there tended to be conflict and a lack of reciprocity between the reentrant and the family or the social support person, and a lack of stability. They also could be a source of depression, stress, and dependence. When we look at romantic partnerships, romantic partners tended to be sources of emotional closeness and also instability and strife. So addressing prior conflicts by revisiting painful memories and having to make amends for past wrongs could tend to lead to a lot of this instability, this stress and strain between those two individuals. Typically, the relationships with women were most beneficial for resources and emotional closeness. When we talk about friends, friends tended to provide material and emotional support for reentrants. However, they could also lead to some risky or tempting situations if these friendships were ones that place them or currently places them in situations where they may engage in more criminal behavior again. So we want to make sure that they're positive pro-social friends that they're hanging out with. And then children were also able to provide sources of emotional support for these reentrants. What they found was that looking at just 1 week after reentry, the time that they spent with family tended to decrease. A lot of them initially came out and had big parties with their families, were getting together with friends and really just soaking up all of that time that they had missed. But this time that they spent with family tended to taper off, even just 1 week after coming home. And then over the course of reentry, they found that the reports of negative social interaction, the amount tended to remain consistent over time, but the reports of positive social interaction tended to decrease over the course of reentry. So as time goes on and reentrants are looking for jobs, they want to achieve the status of a breadwinner, right? They want to come home, they want to have that role fulfillment, feel like they're making it, they're doing it for themselves. But their actual situation tends to be materially and financially dependent on others, typically those social supports. This then leads to increased stress and strain for that reentrant. So looking at social integration, what types of supports are they receiving in addition? When we look at instrumental support, this includes material aids such as housing, transportation, financial assistance. So the instrumental supports are helping them to achieve economic stability typically, but it can also facilitate other social integration that they're having. It can reinforce dependency though, so when the reentrant is home and they're really leaning on those supports for housing, for transportation, for all of these resources and things that they need, they tend to become very dependent on their families and their friends who are providing these for them, which can then threaten their self-efficacy. So when self-efficacy and their autonomy is diminished, the person may find it then hard to leave behind that criminal life and establish that personal narrative of redemption where they feel like they're making it, they've overcome this terrible hardship in their life. So when we look at emotional support, relationships, and these are the relationships and interactions that make a person feel valued and loved, right? So these are integral to a person's self-esteem, their well-being, and just your overall health, right? When you're happy, you're healthy. And they tended to receive this emotional support most often from their children, from romantic partners, parents, and friends as well. So this study used data from the Newark Smartphone Reentry Project. The purpose was to study job seeking and employment during reentry. So the study population was men who were on parole and recently released from prison in Newark, New Jersey, but were not gang members or sex offenders. And the data they collected were from smartphone surveys that individuals filled out 2 times a day. So they would fill out information on their job search and work, their emotional well-being, and other activities they were engaging in. What they found was that transactional social interactions were rare compared to general emotional support. General emotional support was typically described as just simply spending time with others. And they reported that job opportunities and spending time with someone tended to be the highlights of their day. So the transactional supports were things such as the family members giving them possible job opportunities, receiving food from churches, getting information on reentry programs, and even receiving gifts from friends. Of the 7% of reported problems, 7% was in negative social interactions. And this most commonly came from current and former romantic partners, but also was a result of experiencing, again, things like death, illness, and loss within those social circles. I find this chart very interesting because when you look at the sources of support, primarily the positive supports tended to come from family, children, and significant others. They reported that even the mundane everyday tasks with children were some of the best parts of their day, doing things like homework, shopping, simply walking their children to school. And the milestones in their children's lives were very, very important to them. They reported things like their children graduating 2nd grade, achievements they had in school, holidays, and even birth of their children. So they did speak more of time spent with daughters than sons, and I wonder what you all think of that. And how do you think this impacts the sons as they were growing up? What's interesting, though, is that over time, positive social interactions did decrease, and negative interactions tended to stay the same, as we mentioned before. So let's discuss Chapter 7 of Homeward, where Bruce Western discusses family. So still, some more sources of support and how important this is. So Bruce found that the main source of support tended to come from family. And family was referring to mothers or sisters, sometimes grandmothers, who were economically more secure and offered a bed for the reentrant. So while these women had steady jobs, a stable home, they were still all classified typically as poor and struggling financially. So they were not well off by any means to be supporting these reentrants. The average age of mothers was 52, while the average age of their children who were the reentrants were about 30. And they noted that the older women tended to be sort of the anchors of social life in these poor communities. So men who did not have help were more likely to be in shelters, on the streets, relied more on government benefits, and also had fewer friends that they reported they could talk to. And these families were able to provide things like food, housing, clothing, transportation, and again, emotional support. But that emotional support can also be draining on family members. So those family members reported feelings ranging from exhaustion, anger, sadness, disappointment, but even contentment for those who had children that were addicted to drugs, because they reported that they knew they were safe in prison. And families often watched the children of those who were incarcerated and also put money on their books while they were in prison. So when we looked at the living situations 1 year post incarceration, we see that 10% were living with their partners and children's, less than 25% were living with family members, and 14% found themselves reincarcerated. Homelessness was also reported among the population. So if we notice that only 10% is living with their partner and their children, how much contact are they having with their children? Looking at the parents of the incarcerated children, so when we're talking about the reentrants and their parents, they tended to have hardships of their own. They reported things like addiction, struggling with mental health and financial issues, experiencing physical abuse, typically from partners, and homelessness while the children were growing up. So these hardships undoubtedly impacted their children and possibly impacted their life in ways that may have played a part in them engaging in criminal behaviors. So family complexity, we can see these families are very complex, right? It's pretty easy to see. But family complexity is actually a danger to the well-being of children. So when fathers don't live with their children and they provide little social or financial support, that's impacting those children. This can be magnified by multiple partner fertility, which is simply when one parent has children with multiple other people. So over half of the parents in this sample that had 2 biological children had them with different individuals. Romantic partners and children were also largely absent, but they did tend to keep in touch via phone or scheduled visits, or when the reentrants visited their parents and their parents, the grandparents, were watching the children, they would be able to see them. 60% did report having contact at least once a week with their children. But there was also discord among the romantic partners and the mothers of their children. They more often described these relationships as being more like friends than it was being a romantic relationship. And while 2/3 of the population had children, only 10% actually reported feeling like a father figure. So let's sum these 2 readings up before we get into the consequences of mental and physical health and looking at a health-based model. So spending time with significant others was a high point of the day for these individuals. They also reported things like volunteering and giving back to the community, which does play a role in rehabilitation and assistance from crime. There is a high value that was placed on emotional closeness and reconnecting with friends and family. And instrumental support was the most commonly reported type of support that they received. When we look at social relationships and interactions, this tended to be the most important problem that they reported within their day. And they also received a variety of sources of social support, everything from children, such as the importance of fatherhood, romantic partners, spoke of the importance with the relationships with the women in their lives, the importance of fatherhood, and just their families in general. And then positive reports of social interactions and relationships did tend to decrease over time. Again, while those reports of the negative reports of social interactions tended to stay steady. So let's look briefly at the health-based model of desistance and what this could look like. So what is the theory behind a health-based model? Well, mental and physical health states do have key implications for employment, financial stability, family relationships, and ultimately recidivism. So fulfilling the adult roles can trigger the desistance process for individuals. Remember those hooks for change we talked about? And employment can be one of those hooks and one of those turning points for individuals that really fosters that pro-social identity. Fortunately, employment and family ties are critical for promoting desistance from crime. So we need to focus, again, remember these are criminogenic needs, employment, family circumstances. But there's a possible direct link between physical health issues and crime and mental health and reentry outcomes. So chronic health issues can hinder the ability to secure or maintain employment. And those who experienced incarceration are likely to suffer from poor health, things such as infectious diseases and stress, and even decreased life expectancy, because confinement can either trigger or worsen general health and depressive symptoms even over a very short period of time. Or confinement can even create the development of new problems that the individual didn't have before. And it's also important to look at the stigma of the physical disability and mental illness extended to family members who provide that critical, instrumental, and emotional support. So having physically and mentally ill family members can cause strain between them and their families. So let's look at the physical and mental health and their impacts on the adult role fulfillment. So there's a stigma associated with mental illness and physical disabilities. But unfortunately, that offender status tends to limit the individuals to physically taxing industries. So, being an ex-offender, being an incarcerated individual tends to lead those individuals who are reentering to then have jobs that are, you're typically not going to see them as your lawyers, your bankers. You're going to see them in jobs that are your warehouse workers, your construction workers, your builders. They're jobs that are physically taxing on the body. So if they've already, if their health problems have been exacerbated in prison and then they're coming out and they're having to work, again, very hard on their body, this is going to lead to additional physical health issues that could come out. And physical health has been linked to depressive symptoms. So physical health issues can actually either bring out or exacerbate those depressive symptoms. And then depression can lead to absences at work, having a poorer performance, and even the risk of termination. So family conflict can result then because of the heavy dependence on family members for the emotional and tangible support that they're looking for. So having physical health limitations means that the family is going to be leaned on more for transportation to work, medical appointments, financial assistance. So these social supports can be really instrumental in helping individuals find employment, which can then facilitate that assistance process. But in the meantime, or while that individual is finding that work, they typically need assistance getting on their feet. And what this can lead to is courtesy stigma. So think of it similarly to secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, where you're not the individual that is stigmatized, but because you're associating with a stigmatized person, you can also tend to feel the same effects of that stigma. So this is a negative result of associating with a stigmatized person. So these family members can tend to feel doubly stigmatized when their family member, or the person that's leaning on them, has the stigma of being a former prisoner, and then also the stigma of having mental health disorders. So looking at the role that employment, family conflict, and financial problems can play in the assistance process, we look at families being able to provide bonds through expressive and instrumental support that can foster desistance. So family tends to lead to access to employment for individuals. And family conflict can be initiated or exacerbated by unemployment, which can increase the likelihood of arrest. However, having the presence of family conflict does not always mean the absence of instrumental or expressive supports. So it's possible that there can be family conflict, but that they're still providing their supports to that individual. Stable employment can then confer that sort of adult status and supports achievement of financial and pro-social goals for that individual, which again gives them the confidence, gives them self-esteem, and a positive image of themselves to help them desist from crime and see themselves in a new light. And then economic hardship can, again, tend to be a source of strain, which is then going to increase the likelihood of criminal behavior to achieve those economic goals. Or they may act out violently out of frustration because they can't achieve those roles that they're attempting to achieve. If we think back to one of the first slides in this presentation, looking at where they want to fulfill those adult roles, but they're still really dependent on their family members or social supports, that leads to strain and stress, which can lead to offending. So what is the impact of health on crime? Well, the relationship between mental illness and crime is actually weakly linked to offending. So, when independent of other factors, but heightened exposure to other risk factors like substance abuse, homelessness, strained relationships can then increase offending. So, while mental illness specifically does not lead to crime, essentially, when you have mental illness and then they're also exposed to substance abuse, homelessness, strained relationships, this combination of things is what is then linked to an increase in offending. And we know that those who are mentally ill do tend to experience those other risk factors more often than those who do not have mental illnesses. And offending is more likely to predict poor health versus poor health predicting offending. So it's like, which came first? Offending is more likely to predict poor health outcomes. So someone who's involved in offending is more likely to have poor health issues than someone who's in poor health going out and committing an offense. They also found that teenage offending can actually be linked to later injury and cardiovascular illnesses by the age of 48. So engaging in offending even early on is likely to predict poor health outcomes. They also found, though, a positive relationship between physical health issues and crime. So while mental illness was not linked to offending specifically, there is a relationship between having physical health issues and engaging in offending. And physical health limitations can compromise roles and statuses in adulthood, typically in the form of blocked opportunities, family conflict, and financial hardships. So the current study investigated direct and indirect impacts of two key aspects of health. They looked at physical limitations and depression on crime and reincarceration. They pulled roughly 1,500 men across 12 states from the Serious and Violent Offender Reentry Initiative study sample. And what they found with the direct effects is that re-entering with physical health limitations decreased that individual's ability to hold employment. Those who had greater physical health limitations were also likely to be released with depressive symptoms. And remember, physical health limitations can exacerbate depressive symptoms. So an increase in those depression symptoms then was associated with increased family conflict. Though depressive symptoms did not impact actually securing employment. Working after release was resulted in less family conflict. So when someone was out of the home, they were working, they had that positive self-esteem, they were able to fulfill that adult role of holding employment and providing for themselves. That was able to reduce family conflict. And when we look at an increase in family conflict, it did have a significant and strong direct effect on self-reported crime. So those individuals who had a lot of family conflict did self-report increase in crime and criminal behaviors. Additionally, financial problems after release predicted an increase in crime and likelihood of reincarceration. Again, if they can't afford their basic needs, if they can't afford the things that they need to successfully re-enter, if they're not able to make their fines and their payments, if they're on supervision, that's all going to lead to an increase in crime and a greater likelihood that they'll go back to jail or prison. And finally, employment had a negative impact on crime. So when someone was employed, when someone had gainful employment, they were less likely to engage in criminal behaviors. So holding a job is very important to have someone desist from criminal offending. So just briefly, the indirect pathways that the study showed was that depression can lead to reincarceration by way of family conflict, which can tend to lead to crime and then reincarceration. Similarly, depression leads to family conflict, which can then lead to financial hardship for the individual and reincarceration. Because at the root of all this is family conflict, right? Having those having depressive symptoms and it causing strain and stress not only on the individual experiencing it, but the family members that they're leaning on. Remember that courtesy stigma? So similarly, when we look at physical health has also been linked to crime and reincarceration through the pathway of family conflict, namely through diminished employment opportunities and a lack of employment. So if you have poor physical health, the inability to obtain gainful employment or hold employment, again, we're going to lead to more family conflict here, which then leads to crime and reincarceration. So at the root of all this is, while it starts with their health, those health issues and concerns do have a huge impact on the families and social supports that are being leaned on, which creates that family conflict. So if we take a look at this being a health-based model, so why do we want to focus then on the health of the individual? Well, we've seen that their health, while it's at the very start of family conflict. So physical limitations and depression can affect adult role fulfillment, leading to further offending and reincarceration. More specifically, violent victimization, the contraction of communicable diseases, and poor nutrition can exacerbate that human frailty that we talked about in a previous week. So by focusing on a health-based model, we can improve reentry efforts by improving first the health conditions that prisoners experience the second they step through those doors, and by addressing the health-based needs of reentrants to make sure that those depressive symptoms, that those physical limitations are not causing more family conflict, which then leads to more crime and reincarceration. So that was your week 9 lecture on the consequences of incarceration and reentry. I hope that was helpful, and I hope everyone has a wonderful week.